Napoleon is remembered as a man of cannons, cavalry, and maps that kept changing shape. But if you strip the smoke away, his most effective weapon was not the army that marched across Europe. It was the invisible machinery that made those marches possible when France had no business affording them. Because cannons can win a battle, but credit can keep an empire alive long enough to fight the next 10. And in the early 19th century, Napoleon learned a lesson that modern governments still live by. If you can control belief in money, you can borrow power from the future and spend it in the present. When he took power, France was not a rising superpower. It was a nation that had suffered a financial near-death experience. The revolution had shattered institutions, the currency had been discredited, and trust had evaporated into something more dangerous than poverty: cynicism. In that world, gold is not just metal, it is psychology. Paper is not just paper, it is a test of whether people still agree to live inside the same reality. Napoleon understood that the fastest way to rebuild authority was not only to defeat enemies on the battlefield, but to rebuild the idea that French money meant something again, and that the state could be relied upon to keep its promises. That is why one of his most consequential moves was not a military campaign, but a financial architecture. In the year 1800, the Banque de France was created as a private institution with a public mission, designed to restore stability and make credit flow again. It looked like a bank, but it functioned like a lever of state power. It could issue notes, stabilize payments, and help manage debt, while projecting the appearance of discipline and order. It told merchants their contracts would be honored. It told soldiers their pay would hold value. It told citizens that chaos was over, and that the state had regained its grip on the future. And once that belief returned, Napoleon did what every ambitious empire does when it discovers a new fuel source. He turned it into motion. War required money at a scale France could not cover with taxes or treasure. So he leaned into the weapon that does not need to be mined: credit. Victory would raise confidence. Confidence would raise the price of bonds. Bonds would raise the money to fund the next campaign. War would become self-financing, at least as long as the spell held. That is the heart of this story. Napoleon did not just fight Europe. He built a machine where finance and warfare became a single system, and he dared the continent to keep believing in it. Once that machine was in motion, it reshaped Europe in ways that armies alone never could. Napoleon's wars did not just redraw borders. They rewired incentives. Every victory signaled strength to creditors. Every treaty reinforced the idea that lending to France was not reckless, but rational. Merchants and bankers did not need to love Napoleon. They only needed to believe that he would keep winning. And for a time, that belief was extraordinarily profitable. Government bonds rose in value after each campaign. Future spoils were priced into present contracts. Credit became a wager on conquest, and conquest became collateral. Behind the scenes, a new financial class learned how to operate inside this system. Financiers speculated on campaigns, moved capital across borders, and arbitraged information faster than armies could march. War became a market. Defeat and victory were reflected not only in headlines, but in bond prices and exchange rates. Napoleon understood their usefulness even as he distrusted them. He famously despised bankers as unpatriotic, yet he relied on them because they were essential to keeping the machine alive. This uneasy partnership between state power and private finance is one of the most enduring legacies of his rule. But systems built on belief have a fatal weakness. They require continuous reinforcement. Each year of war demanded more borrowing. Each new territory brought not just resources, but obligations. Armies had to be fed, administrators paid, infrastructure rebuilt, pensions promised. Tax revenues lagged behind ambition. The richer provinces were drained first, then the weaker ones were squeezed. What began as finance slowly turned into extraction. Occupied states were forced to mint French currency, buy French goods, and fund French campaigns. Credit stopped being voluntary and started becoming compulsory. This is where the illusion began to strain. Confidence can stretch reality, but it cannot replace it forever. As costs mounted, the financial discipline that once stabilized France started to erode. Paper issuance crept upward. Reserves thinned. Victories still came, but they arrived with diminishing returns. The empire was expanding geographically while hollowing itself financially. The machine still ran, but it ran hotter, louder, and closer to failure with every turn. The breaking point came not from a single defeat, but from a convergence of limits. Geography, logistics, and liquidity all began to push back at the same time. Britain, watching this system carefully, understood that Napoleon's empire did not need to be destroyed on land. It needed to be starved of confidence and cash. Control of the seas gave London exactly that leverage. Naval dominance meant blockades, and blockades meant no easy movement of gold, goods, or credit. France could dominate the continent and still find itself trapped inside it, rich in territory but poor in liquidity. Napoleon's answer was the continental system, an attempt to weaponize economic control on a scale never seen before. By banning European trade with Britain, he believed he could collapse British commerce and, with it, British credit. It was a logical move within his worldview. If money was belief, then cutting off trade would shatter belief. But systems based on coercion behave differently from systems based on consent. Britain adapted. Trade routes shifted. Markets relocated. Capital flowed where it was welcome. Meanwhile, continental Europe began to suffocate. Prices rose. Shortages spread. And entire regions slipped into stagnation. As hardship deepened, enforcement became harsher. Smuggling flourished. Corruption turned into survival. Allies quietly broke the embargo while publicly pledging loyalty. Napoleon responded with more decrees, more inspections, more punishment. Each act of control weakened the very trust his system depended on. The financial machine, once elegant, became brittle. It required constant pressure just to keep moving, and pressure destroys what it tries to preserve. By the time the empire turned east toward Russia, the illusion was already cracking. Soldiers were paid late or in money that no longer held its value. Supplies were rationed. Local substitutes replaced official currency. The invasion was not just a military gamble. It was a financial one. When the campaign collapsed, it destroyed the last reserve of belief, holding the system together. Credit evaporated. Merchants refused government paper. Even the institutions designed to stabilize France were forced into desperation, borrowing privately just to survive. What followed was not just the fall of a ruler, but the exposure of a pattern. Once the illusion broke, everything that had been sustained by it unraveled at once. The state could still command, but it could no longer convince. Creditors demanded real repayment. Citizens hoarded metal. Trade slowed as trust vanished. Napoleon, who once believed that confidence could be engineered indefinitely, found himself governing an empire that existed on paper more than in reality. When belief disappeared, the machine seized, and there was no emergency decree strong enough to restart it. Yet history rarely discards effective tools. When the old monarchies returned after Napoleon's defeat, they did not dismantle his financial architecture. They preserved it. The Banque de France survived because it had proven something invaluable. Control of credit meant control of the state. Its hybrid structure, private in form yet political in function, became a template. It could issue currency, manage debt, and fund war, all while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. This paradox was not a flaw. It was the feature that made it so powerful. Other powers took note. Prussia studied the model. Austria adapted it. Russia sought to emulate it. Across the Atlantic, the United States observed carefully. By the middle of the 19th century, nearly every serious power had adopted a variation of this design. Central banking became the nervous system of modern states. Wars were no longer paid for with treasure alone, but with promises stretched across generations. The battlefield shifted. The decisive front was no longer only physical, it was financial. The greatest irony is that Napoleon's system did not secure France's dominance. It accelerated Britain's. Forced to compete, London refined its own financial weapon. British bonds became synonymous with safety. Investors trusted institutions over individuals, rules over decrees. The pound emerged as the anchor of global trade, not because Britain conquered more land, but because it convinced the world that its credit would outlast any war. Napoleon commanded belief. Britain cultivated it. That difference decided the future. What makes this story endure is not Napoleon's defeat, but his afterlife. Empires fall, but systems linger. The man who died in exile left behind something far more resilient than armies or borders. He left a blueprint, a way of fusing political authority with financial control so seamlessly that it could survive regime change. The lesson his successors absorbed was simple and unsettling. You do not need endless gold if you can borrow tomorrow's confidence today. You do not need permanent victory if you can delay the reckoning long enough. This is why the modern world still operates inside a Napoleonic logic. Governments fund wars, welfare, and crises not by raising immediate resources, but by issuing debt backed by belief. Central banks stabilize markets not by producing wealth, but by managing expectations. When panic threatens, they inject liquidity. When growth slows, they promise support. The machinery looks technical, but at its core it is psychological. It depends on the shared assumption that obligations will be honored and that the future will be able to pay for the present. Napoleon proved both the power and the danger of that assumption. As long as confidence holds, the system appears immortal. It can absorb shocks, expand outward, and postpone consequences. But confidence is not capital. It cannot feed armies, repair roads, or harvest crops. It can only buy time. And time, when borrowed repeatedly, becomes debt in its purest form. The moment belief falters, the entire structure is revealed for what it is, a promise waiting to be tested. Today, when states print money with keystrokes and markets rise on liquidity rather than production, we are not witnessing a new invention. We are watching the refinement of an old weapon. Napoleon did not just redraw the map of Europe. He redrew the relationship between power and money. His empire collapsed when confidence ran out, but the system he pioneered never did. It simply changed flags, uniforms, and names. And that is the quiet warning history leaves behind. Empires built on borrowed trust rarely collapse in flames. They fade when belief thins, when confidence no longer stretches far enough to cover reality. Napoleon learned that too late. The question is whether the world he helped create will recognize it in time. What makes Napoleon's story matter is not that it ended in defeat, but that it never really ended at all. His empire collapsed, but the logic he perfected survived him, and quietly became normal. The idea that a state could fuse political authority with financial machinery, borrow against belief, and sustain power through managed confidence did not disappear at Waterloo. It matured. It was refined. And it became the foundation of the modern world. Every contemporary government now operates inside this framework. Wars are no longer paid for upfront. Crises are no longer endured. They are financed. Central banks exist to stabilize belief when reality wobbles. Debt is issued, not as a last resort, but as a permanent feature of governance. The promise is always the same. Growth will come later, stability will return, the future will absorb the cost. This is Napoleon's machine, scaled globally and automated, running not on silver or conquest, but on expectations. The danger is not debt itself. Debt can be productive when it is disciplined. The danger is the illusion of permanence. Napoleon believed confidence could always be commanded, extended, or forced. Modern systems believe confidence can be engineered indefinitely through liquidity, intervention, and reassurance. But history is unambiguous on this point. Confidence is not infinite. It cannot replace productivity, trust, or restraint forever. It can delay consequences, but it cannot erase them. Empires built on borrowed belief rarely collapse dramatically. They stall, they thin out, they lose credibility one promise at a time. Markets stop responding. Citizens stop trusting. The machinery still exists, but it no longer convinces. Napoleon learned this when his armies were still marching but his credit had already died. That sequence matters, because it is always the same. Financial faith breaks before political power does. And that is why this story is not about the past. It is about the structure we live inside today. Central banks, reserve currencies, infinite debt, and managed trust did not emerge from peace and prosperity. They were forged in war, ambition, and desperation. Napoleon did not just change Europe, he changed money, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. If this analysis reshaped how you see debt, power, and modern finance, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who still believes money is just numbers, and subscribe. History does not repeat word for word, but it does repeat its systems, and understanding them is the first step toward seeing what comes next.